Karen to please come up. She is the prioress of this community. Sister Karen.
Welcome, one and all. This is indeed a momentous occasion for our community, the Benedictine Sisters. We've never had this many people in this room. So we're making history. Please note that. On behalf of the Benedictine Sisters, it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this historic event. In April of this year, our community will celebrate 10 years of living in Bakerstown. Those 10 years hardly compare to the Brickell House built in the 1830s. What does compare, however, is hospitality. Hospitality is to be a characteristic of Benedictine women and men. We are honored and blessed to share property, and actually to own the property now, with a family that once housed our brothers and sisters through the Underground Railroad. We are glad to have you with us. Welcome.
Stay here just for a minute. So that's gonna, because I'm going to have you come up again.
Okay. I don't want to trip over this.
Can you? Okay.
It's around my legs.
So on the other, come around the other way.
All this way.
Oops.
Come this way here.
I wanted to do a little dance.
Here, there you go, Paul. Okay, there we go. Watch out there. My name is Paul White. I am the acting president of the Richland History Group. It is great to see so many of you here this afternoon. I'd like to point out that there is an emergency door, 2 doors right behind us, and there is certainly the door that you came in. We are here today not only to celebrate Black History Month, but to recognize the role that this very site played in that history. And that role was to help free enslaved people. And second, I'd like to point out that not only did the Brickell House do that, but this area, Bakerstown, Richland Township, and Northern Hampton Township also played a major role in so doing. Before we start to honor our past, though, I'd like to have another community here be recognized and honored for their service to humanity and to our God. Could the Benedictine Sisters of Pittsburgh please stand if you are able to? If you're not, could you just raise your hand? Thank you. The Richland History Group would like to announce that each of you is now a lifetime member in the Richland History Group. You need never pay any dues. In addition, I'd just like to say this. I've probably been over here how many times in the last 2 months? Many. And I have never been treated so well. The sisters here love to serve. I'm not used to being served quite like that. My wife is very independent. And I'd also like to point out that these sisters have taken a vow for poverty. And I'd also like to point out, I believe that this sisterhood takes more vows than any other Roman Catholic sisterhood. So, congratulations to the 34 new members. And now I'd like to say that unfortunately, I regret to tell you that the Richland History Group voted not to accept your generous contribution of $265. You have taken a vow of poverty. You have gone out of your way to let us stay here. So I would like to return on behalf of the Richland History Group a check for $265, and I'd like to present this to you. Thank you.
For which we are very grateful. Thank you.
I'd like to acknowledge some folks here today, just a few. I'd like Peter and Nancy Gilbert to stand up. Peter and Nancy are the owners, relatively recently, of the Scott's Tavern, the former McCaslin farmhouse, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Delightful people. At the intermission, you might want to query them about their place. It's a magnificent place. I'll talk about it a little bit, but great to have you here. I'd like to just point out a couple of people. Ruth Johnston, who will be coming up in a moment, you can raise your hand, Ruth, is the editor of the Richland History Group. And I'd like to, Chuck Steiner, where Chuck is our acting vice president. And there are others here. I know Ginny Neff Campbell will be coming later. She's our treasurer. Now I'd like to also acknowledge and ask to come up here your very talented healthcare agent. She is a graduate of, first of all, she's a graduate. She has a master's degree from Notre Dame. She is has played many roles here, and she also was an undergraduate from Carlow College. She was a nurse at Allegheny General Hospital. She has played many, many roles teaching school, high school, and I'd like to ask Sister Judith Ann Kreiner to come up.
Thank you. I'd like to say thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to share our home and the gift that we've been blessed with to be a part of Richland Township. Also like to say a big thank you to Paul and the Richland History Group for really making this event happen. They've put a tremendous amount of work into helping put this day together, and If it wasn't for all of their hard work, it wouldn't have happened. Paul asked me to give you a little insight into the Benedictine Sisters of Pittsburgh, who we are and why we became members of Richland Township about 10 years ago. The history of the Benedictines goes back over 1,500 years to the time of our founders, Saints Benedict and Scholastica of Norcia, Italy. We know that Benedict was born in 480 AD, and he began his quest for prayer and solitude at an early age in the mountains outside of Rome. By the end of Benedict's life in 547, he had developed 12 monasteries that followed the rule that he wrote, and is still used today by countless men and women all over the world. Benedict's most famous monastery, where he died at Cassino, Italy, is called Monte Cassino, and some of you may have heard of that. It was the most famous monastery and abbey in World War II that was survived the bombardment. Throughout the centuries, the followers of Benedict, known as monastics, spread throughout the world, creating centers of prayer, community, hospitality, learning, and refuge. Our community of women traces our roots to the 11th century abbey of St. Walburg in Eichstätt, Bavaria. When pioneers came to the New World, missionary priests sought religious women and men to help form centers of religion and education for the emerging populations in the wilderness territories. 3 Benedictine sisters left this abbey of St. Walburg in 1852 to create the first center of Benedictine monastic life for women at St. Mary's, PA in Elk County, Pennsylvania. Some people might know that place. From St. Mary's, our early sisters traveled to form elementary schools in Johnstown and Carrollton, PA in 1870. This was the beginning of the Benedictine Sisters of Pittsburgh as we know it today. Founded that very first year in Carrollton, Pennsylvania, under the leadership of Mother Alagunda Feldman and her fledgling group of sisters. As we work toward our 153rd year of existence, we continue to support the same vision, the same charism that has been passed from St. Benedict to each of the women and men who follow the rule of St. Benedict. Our life centers around prayer, community, and ministry. Prayer is our first calling. Community exists in this group of women who have joined one another in support and challenge to live each day fully in God's presence. Ministry for us is a call to seek out the needs of our geographic area and beyond, and learn how we can be of service to God's people. In 2010, this community of women began to search to find a location to construct a new monastery that would better serve our needs. Our former monastery that was located on Perrysville Avenue consisted of 2 very large buildings and 3 smaller residences. At that time, we felt that our call to stewardship invited us to seriously look at the need to downsize our carbon footprint. We looked at property after property in southwestern Pennsylvania. I mean, we looked. I know I have counted over 50 sites at that time. None seemed to meet our needs or to speak to us as the place where we would want to call home. It was after seeing an advertisement on the internet for a piece of property on Bakerstown Road that a few of the sisters had the opportunity to see this property and the Bricklehouse for the very first time. And there we learned that it had been a part of the Underground Railroad. As those sisters walked the grounds outside, it became easy to feel peace and harmony that seemed to really pervade the landscape. It was then that one of them remarked, "You can feel this place was already blessed." And the reason that Richland became the site of our new monastery is that after all the sisters had an opportunity to tour the building and the grounds, they too joined in the sentiment that we moved to construct our new monastery in Richland because this land already felt blessed. Blessed by those who had lived here prior to us coming, and the history of their sacrifices that others might live and be free. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
We will have an intermission after our first speaker, but I'd like to just have stand a young woman, just turned 94. She's a pianist. She composes much of her music. She is a Roman Catholic. She is in my Bible study at St. Barnabas Village, and she approached me and said she would like to come to this program to play enslaved people spirituals. So she will be playing at the intermission. She'll be playing what were called Negro spirituals, but I say enslaved people spirituals. And by the way, you should know that those were not just spiritual songs. Those were songs that provided communication among the passengers on the Underground Railroad, telling them when they were leaving, telling them what route they might take, warning them, etc. So there was a double meaning to all of those words. Amelia Rivero also composes her own music, but she came to me and said, "I feel so strongly about this, I'd like to come play for this." Amelia, could you just stand up? So she will serenade us at the intermission and then a little bit right afterwards. The final person I'd like to come up before our first featured speaker is Ruth Johnston. I mentioned her earlier, but the beauty of Ruth is, as an editor, as an author, she can make anyone's writing look good. So, you know, if you're an average writer but would like to do an article for the Richland History Group, which we put in the Pine Creek Journal Monthly and we have online on Trib Live Media, she will make you appear to be Tolstoy. Ruth, could you come on up?
Just try standing. But I promise nobody will have to die at the end of your article. You know, Tolstoy had some of those issues. 3 years ago, when Paul was first talking with a group of people about restarting, really founding a new Richland History Group, he kept saying, you know, the important thing is to find a way to get people to start doing history right at the start. Because, you know, when you start something, you're focused on bylaws and, you know, whatever, that kind of thing. And he said, we need to get people doing local history. And I didn't say, but I thought, what does that mean? And so I've seen a couple things now. One of them, the project about putting articles in the Pine Creek Journal, that's been wonderful. It's, you know, been a way to get people to start doing history. And the second project that I'm going to talk about is another really great one, because this is something that I guess in a way, the state set this up for local history groups to have a project. And that's the markers that we see around, the historical markers. So last April or May, Jenny Campbell, who's involved with the DAR, let Paul know that there was a deadline coming up, but hadn't been met yet, but the deadline was coming up for submitting for a state marker. And he decided it would be great to just try that for the Brickell House as an Underground Railroad station. We put something together as quickly as we could. Obviously, it had to be pretty fast, and submitted it. It took them months to get through the record number of submissions that they had. And in the end, I think they turned ours down. They approved 37 of them, and it's taking the state a while even to get those processed. And they said they're going to pause for another, this coming June, they're not going to accept anything new, but then we'll open it again after that. One of the problems that you have when you're looking at coming up with evidence for historical place almost 200 years later is, of course, that the people aren't there anymore. The best source we had was a newspaper article. This, obviously, this is just a kind of a, this is from 1935, I think. Bakerstown, once station on Underground Railroad of slave days. And in, I meant to do that. In 1935, of course, they could still find people who had a personal memory of that. They'd been children or their parents had told them about it. And so we have in this newspaper article a few comments that local people said. They said, I remember this, I remember that, my parents told me this. It's been a little while since 1935, and it's getting harder to find more sources. And really, what we need to be doing as we move forward with this project, the project will be that when they next have a deadline, we're going to have an application in. And it's going to be a killer application. It's just going to knock them flat. And so it turns out that we need to have people start, I don't even know where you'd go to find more information. We need to find more about the history of the issue in the area, which is really what our speakers today are about. And also anything about the Brickell House or other properties nearby that were used like that. So it becomes kind of a group project. They gave us some tips on a few books to check out, but it's not that the book has a page where it goes, the Brickell House, and it's all right there. It's not like that. So it becomes really a group project. Anybody here who has an interest, especially if you're local and you grew up hearing anything like that, we need you. So we'll be forming some kind of a working group to try to gather things together and see what we can come up with. So, okay.
There's one other person I'd like to acknowledge, and Debbie Lokay, one of our members who volunteered her time. Debbie, she helped out in many ways here. Debbie, could you just stand up for us? My dear friend Dan Morgan must have slipped out, I'm not sure, but I thank him. He's a member of our group. He helped along with Chuck here, our vice president, to help set this up. Now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for the first half of the program. We'll have the intermission. Amelia will be playing. The sisters apparently have some refreshments for us, and then we'll move into the second half of the program with our featured speaker, Dr. Lawrence Glasgow. And then at the end, if there's time, I'm going to try to end this timely, we will take questions from the audience. We'll have a roving mic. So I'd like to now introduce a woman who has become an authority on the Underground Railroad as someone who just was so fascinated by it. She is a graduate of Duquesne University. She taught school in the Pittsburgh Public School District, and she was a docent at the John Hines History Center, I guess giving tours. And she now, for the last umpteen years, has been speaking around Western Pennsylvania about the Underground Railroad. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Miss Carol Kunz.
Well, I'm pleased to be with you today. I have a lot of things to share with you, a lot of interesting things, a lot of pictures, and I will go to my, can't hear me.
Test, test. Put it closer to your mouth.
Closer to my mouth. Okay. I've never used one of these. Maybe it's ready to be clicked. I think maybe what we should do is begin with Africa. I like to give a little bit of information about those who used the Underground Railroad and a reason why they used it. The place that these people would come from is called Ghana, and it is on the west coast of Africa. Going up here, you would find it. It's a little tiny green spot on this particular map. The people were captured or kidnapped. They were going maybe for a walk, going to work, and they were taken away from everything that they know. They were taken away from their family, first of all, and their family did not know what happened to them. Did not know if they'd ever see them again, and probably they didn't. They were taken away for everything that was familiar, their food. They were thrown with a group of people who didn't speak their language, their culture, their traditions. Everything was new to them. It was gone to them. So, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Now, once they were captured, they chained them and they took them somewhere. For the longest time, I couldn't find where they went, and I knew they had to be taken and stayed in some place for a while until the ship came in. They knew a ship was coming, a slave ship, but they didn't have the communication that we have today. So, about 4 years ago, I saw an article in the paper, and it was an article about Melania Trump went on a trip to Africa. And when she was there, she went to a place called the Cape Coast Castle, which you can see in the top picture. And the Cape Coast Castle was built many years before by the Swiss. They would come to Africa looking for gold and silver. And this is where they put the people that they captured until the ship came in. And this is the inside. She said it was a dungeon. There was the door of no return, and inside there were all sorts of restraining chains, neck braces, all kinds of things that would keep them so they couldn't be moving around. When the ships came in, they had a manifest where they wrote down the names and the ages of the people. Now this is not from a ship that came here, but from a ship that went somewhere else. And I looked at the names, and there was Thomas, Daniel, John, George. I didn't think they were actually African names. And they did have some other names there that could have been African. I wanted to see the age that they wanted because they could get more money. They treated these people like they were property, not like human beings. And the age was maybe around 25, 35, and 40, not too much over 40. Because the better built the person was, the more money that they could get for them. Now, this is a picture of a slave ship that happens to be on fire. And again, it was not one that came here. These are some of the restraints, the neck and leg shackles that you can see. They called this a floating dungeon. And they would strip the men of their clothing and chain them on these slabs that they had inside. Now, sometimes there were women and children that they would capture as well. They had to stay in a different part of the ship. And they put leg chains around the children because they didn't want them running around. It wasn't unusual to see one of the men whose elbow would be completely raw because he would use his elbow as a brace to lift him up a little bit to talk to the person next to him. Occasionally they would let them go up on board ship and walk for a little bit of exercise, and they fed them not too much, mostly rice they would give them because they didn't want them to lose weight. Many people died. There was a certain percentage that died before they arrived in the United States and Charleston area. And the people would, at that time, they would go onto the block. It was called a block where they were sold. This is the inside of a ship that was below the deck, and you can see how the torture was. Apparently they must have let them be up every once in a while, and they sat around. They don't have, some of them do not have clothes on, and it was a very sad situation. There was a lot of sickness and death. Now the sailor, I called them sailors, the shipmates, that was about the lowest job anyone could have. The money that they were promised to get, they may not get when the ship went back to its home port. This is the kind of auction house, and this is a public sale. Now this happened to be a sale of a plantation owner who died, and they had to sell off all of his slaves that he had and all of his furniture and everything that he owned. And so that's what this was showing us. This is a picture of the Boone Plantation. Now many years ago when we were in Myrtle Beach, we took a ride down to Charleston, and I saw the sign, Boone Plantation. I said I'd like to stop there. So we stopped there and took a few pictures. These are the homes that they had to live in. I would think they had dirt floors on them. The ones that had chimneys would have had a fireplace where they could do some cooking on the inside. If they did not have that, then they had to make their meals outside. On Saturday morning, they were delivered their food for the week. And it was some flour, some cornmeal, some lard, maybe some corn or some greens. And that's what they had to make do, a little bit of meat occasionally. One of the jobs that they had when they were there was the sugar cane. And when it was harvest time, that was a very busy time for them. They worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day. They had to cut the sugar cane down low, close to the earth, take the leaves from it, then they put it on a cart, which they pushed to a big, like a warehouse. And in there they had open fires, grinders, rollers, and the manpower made the machine work. Now, if someone's part of their clothing or their finger or something got stuck in there, there was a guard there with a long knife, and he would just come over and cut it, whether it was their finger, their wrist, or their arm. There was a guard always around them. Picking cotton is another one of the things that they did on the plantation. They grew other things besides sugar cane and cotton. They grew tobacco, indigo, which was a dye that they used, and they grew corn as well. Now, this is the cowhide whip that was used to correct someone that did something that they shouldn't do. The enslaved people tried to do things. They would pretend they were sick, or they would hurt themselves in some manner so that they didn't have to work. They even sabotaged some of the tools that they had for out in the fields, and of course, as soon as they were found out, they were beaten. Now, this particular man whipped Peter. He was in Virginia, and he, after his last beating, it said that he went crazy a little bit. Well, he had had so many beatings, and he was not a man that would cause trouble. I read that as well. But he decided to leave, and he and 3 other men on Christmas left the plantation that they were on. The one man was shot very soon after. The other 2 stayed with him, and they traveled for 10 days. Finally, they came to Louisiana, and they met a group, a military group, which welcomed them, and they knew they would be saved if they were with this group. And when he was examined by the doctor, they couldn't believe of all these terrible scars he had. So they took a picture of it, and these pictures then were sent to different states in the North, because the people did not realize, the people in the North did not realize how just awful these people were treated. Now, this picture shows a man who tried to escape, but they caught him and brought him back. They hung him to be an example to the rest of the people. If you try to escape, maybe this will happen to you. I did see at the bottom of this picture that it wasn't documented, so it may not have been true, but it probably was. Now, when they thought about escaping, these people had faith, they had hope, and they were very, very brave. They thought about what it would be like to be free. Maybe they remembered what it was like when they lived back at home in Africa. And they knew they had to go north, and they knew they had the stars to watch, particularly the North Star. There was a song that they sang, "Follow the Drinking Gourd." When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. For an old man's awaiting to carry you to freedom, follow the drinking gourd. So if they could find the Big Dipper, they knew to go from one section straight up to the bottom of the Little Dipper, and that would be Polaris, the North Star. They also knew that they had to find the rivers. They wanted to travel along the rivers. And this is a picture of a map. I had problems finding a map that gave specific information about the Pittsburgh area. But you can see many of them came up, went east, further east. Now, this is a picture of Jocko, Tom Graves. And he was a little boy about 14, 15 years old. And he was in George Washington's unit. Now, George Washington had to be around the Delaware River at one time, and he had to cross the river because he was going to have a battle on the other side. Now, little Jocko went up to him and he pleaded with him. He wanted very much to go with them to fight the battle, but George Washington said to him, "No, you're too young, it's too dangerous, and you should stay here. We need someone to hold the lantern to show us where to come on shore and when we came back. And we need someone to be here with the horses. So Jocko did his job, he obeyed. George Washington and the rest of the men went across the river, had their battle, and when they were coming back, a storm came up. It was snowing, it was freezing, and they did see the lantern in the distance, so they were able to come back on shore exactly when they wanted to, and they could see Jocko standing there. The horses were all there. They went over to Jocko, and poor Jocko was frozen to death, standing there waiting for them. So in commemoration of him and his bravery, George Washington had a statue made. And this statue then, many other people had made, and they would put it in front of their homes so that the enslaved person who was traveling along would know it was a safe house. Now this was called the Underground Railroad, and because it had similarities to the real railroad. Now a railroad that we know has tracks. Well, the Underground Railroad had paths and ways that they traveled through the brush. The Underground Railroad had a conductor, and there was a conductor, the agent, the man who had the safe house. And there were other points that were similar between the two. There was baggage on the railroad, and on the Underground Railroad, those people that were traveling through were called baggage. Now, many years ago when I started to do some investigating and research about this, I was telling my lady friends, and the one girl spoke up and she said, you know, I think I've been on that railroad. And we said, no, I don't think you were on this railroad. But then I thought of it, and she had lived in New York, so she was probably thinking about the subway, because at times it does go underground. But more important than that, I thought she had no idea about the Underground Railroad. I don't think part of the curriculum back many years ago when they should have been taught about it in school. If someone would come into our area by Little Washington, Pennsylvania, they may come upon the Lemoyne House. Now, Dr. Lemoyne was an abolitionist. He was in sympathy with the enslaved people traveling through, and he had a national marker about him being part of the movement. Another place would be the Bingham House in Chatham Village, and you see there's a porch on the back of the house there. Mr. Bingham was an attorney. He had a black nurse, and she would stand on the back of the porch at dusk and look over the hills to see if she could see anyone wandering by, and they looked like maybe they were an enslaved person trying to get to freedom. She would invite them in, give them some warm food and clothing, help them out. These people who left the South were coming into the North, and the weather was quite different, so they needed more clothing. If they came along the Ohio River, followed the river, they might come to Sewickley. In Sewickley there was a church, I think it's still there, St. Matthew's AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And in the evening, the men members of the church would put on their hunting clothes, and they would take a big bag with them, and in the bag they had food and warm clothing, maybe even a pair of shoes, and they would walk around the hills of Sewickley looking for people traveling north and help them out and give them a bag. Now, Duquesne University, if they would come by the Monongahela River, get in that section, up on the hill, they would see the university. When the Holy Ghost Fathers purchased it, the hospital on that site. They moved the hospital across the street and kept the foundation. So later on, when the seminary stayed there, at nighttime, they would hear all kinds of chains rattling and frightening things in the basement. So if you would go onto YouTube, Haunting Duquesne University, there's a nice video. Tom White narrates it, and it's worth watching. It tells the story about Duquesne University. The Monongahela House was a gorgeous, beautiful hotel, and it was a place in Pittsburgh. People were traveling through all the time, going west, and it was a wonderful place to stop. The owners of the Monongahela House were not abolitionists. However, the workers there all were. They would see someone and try to help them to escape. And there's a nice story about that. A little girl by the name of Lynette was there, and they helped her escape. Now, in the early days of Pittsburgh, there were many black entrepreneurs. Many of them were quite wealthy. This happened to be Reverend Woodson. Reverend Woodson eventually became the pastor of the Bethel AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it was located, it is located, I believe, today on Webster Avenue. And he spoke out because he felt education was very, very important. Now, another man was John Peck. John Peck had the original oyster house down in Market Square. There is one there now. I was there for a tour, and they claim to be the original oyster house. However, that one that's there now was built later, and it may be right on the property where the oyster house originally stood. He was a barber. Reverend Woodson was a barber as well. In fact, the next man I tell you about, he was a barber too. So that must have been a good position for them to work into. John Peck had a beauty shop where he did haircuts. He also sold clothing, disguises, hair. He was also very interested in education. So he and Reverend Woodson started the first school for the little black children, and they had it at the church. And of course, the church was a stop on the Underground Railroad, just as well as John Peck's oyster house and his own home, and the other place that he had his business in. This is John Vachon. John Vachon was one of the wealthiest people. He was a barber as well, and he had a bathhouse. Now, the bathhouse was like a spa of today. People would go there. The businessmen, both white and black, would have their meetings there during the daytime, and it was a stop on the Underground Railroad at night. A man by the name of, when he was old enough, he wanted to go to the school. He had desire to be a medical doctor. So his mother and him walked from Chambersburg all the way to Pittsburgh so he could go to school at Reverend Woodson and John Peck's school. He did, and then he wanted to go to Harvard. So he got into Harvard, and he then had to leave. He was only there a very short time. They told him he had to leave, not because he did anything wrong, but the 2 or 3 men with him had to leave also, because the white students would not go into the class where the black students were. Now, Martin Delaney did become a doctor. Remember that man, the Lemoyne, Dr. Lemoyne that I mentioned to you earlier, he would come down from Washington, PA, and work with Martin Delaney and show him how to treat people when they were sick. They did a lot of leeches back in those days and coupling. And there was a cholera epidemic when Dr. Delaney had his practice. And all the white doctors left town because they were afraid of getting sick. He stayed and took care of the people. He also had a newspaper. It was called The Mystery. And when there was a fire in 1845, excuse me, it was the only paper that did not burn down. So his was the paper that gave the information all about the fire. He was highly, you might see a picture of him in military clothes because he was highly decorated. He was a part of the Civil War. Another man, Charles Avery, was on the north side. He had the Avery Institute at the corner of Nash and Avery Avenue. He went to the south a lot to buy cotton. He sold cotton, he sold pharmacy supplies as well. And when he went to the south, he was totally shocked and surprised at the way the people were treated. So when he came back, he started the Avery Institute as a school for the black secondary and elementary. It was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was up from the Allegheny River, up the hill from the Allegheny River. At the time, there was a little canal down there. And so someone who had been, if he had stayed at a safe house, they could take him in a rowboat down the Allegheny in this canal and maybe say to him, there's a shrub up on the hill, go up, and behind it there is an entrance to a tunnel. There was a tunnel that would take them to the basement of the Avery Institute. And then on the first floor, he was a Methodist minister, so he had his church there. This is just a picture of what the area looked like back in those days. If they somehow got to Gertie's Run, Gertie's Creek, they might come to the Evergreen Hotel, where the Evergreen Hotel was. Now, when it was being torn down, the man, John Chakosky, who was the president of both Ross and Westview Historical Society, went through the building because there was someone that was trying to say it was a site on the Underground Railroad. However, again, the time wasn't right when it was built. But when he went out into the back, there was this big stone wall, and there was a opening there that you can see, and inside there was a room. So it possibly could have been a stop on the railroad. It was originally a stagecoach stop, and right above it was the Evergreen Hamlet, and that was a lot of abolitionists lived up in there. These are other places on Mount Royal Boulevard. There was the Tisherman's house. These people lived there. Now, this was in the paper in 2000 in the Post-Gazette. They lived there for about 14 years. They knew there was a door in one of the 3 rooms in their basement. If they opened it up, it was all dirt. And here there was tunnel coming to their house. When they had some work done, they were going to build something. They discovered this tunnel. Another house was the Weitzel house. I'm trying to hurry now because my time's up here. And this is your Brickell house, and Paul is going to give you some information about that shortly. Now, if they were on Route 19 and going out by Zillionople on the corner of Beaver and Main Street, there was the Stouffer house. Those Stouffers came from Bolivia, or Bulgaria, and he was a cooper. He made tubs and vats and barrels. and it was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. In Bridgewater, Beaver, there was a house that was a stop, and it had secret passages through the house so that they could get the enslaved person out. Going a little bit further, we come to Mercer, and in Mercer, at one time there was a man by the name of Travis, and he purchased for $2 150 acres, and a couple years later he had 400 acres. So there was a group of people that wanted to have their own town, African American people. And it started, they had clapboard houses, 1 and 2 stories. They had a meeting house, and the 1890 census or 1880 census said there were 24 people living there. However, I read someplace else that there were over 100 people living there. And unfortunately, at that time, the fugitive slave law was being enacted again highly. It never stopped, I guess. And the people were afraid because not only were they capturing escaped enslaved people, but they were taking people who had never been enslaved back and selling them. Now, there is a cemetery there today. It's in Stoneborough. The cemetery is called the Freedom Road Cemetery. There are members who were in the military that are buried there. And there's a cross there, and it says, whoever is buried there is known only to God, because they don't have the names of the people. One other thing I wanted to tell you about was Malvina Shields. She was born a slave in South Carolina, and then she later got her freedom. She went on to another part of the States, and they have engraved on here, she moved to Kingston, which was in Georgia, and to be near her family. And her family would endure 5 generations of becoming people of the country here. And they began in oppression, and it would lead her descendants to be the First Lady of the United States. So she was the 5th great-grandmother of Michelle Obama. And then I have some information about Kwanzaa. It's a holiday, and also Juneteenth. And these pictures are all on the tables outside if you want to see them again or read some of the information. You're welcome to do so, and I want to thank you for your kind attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was wonderful. We will be having a panel question series at the end, so you'll have a chance to talk to Carol and to talk to our keynote speaker. I'd like to introduce you to someone who just came in. She's very involved with the DAR, but she's a key person for us. She's our treasurer, and I'd like to introduce Ginny Neff Campbell. Ginny, could you stand up back here? It's refreshment time. Amelia Rosero will be here playing Enslaved People Spirituals. Have some refreshments, and we'll try to go no more than 10 minutes, and we'll come back. Blue Hen, we have a lot of fun going back and forth. Anyway, he has almost handedly been responsible for getting chairs here, for handling all of that. But he also gives sermons at a Presbyterian church. So Dan Morgan, standing here, has been immeasurable help to pull this off. Our keynote speaker is indeed an accomplished scholar and community-oriented gentleman. We are very honored to have him here today. He's a graduate of Antioch College, and he has his doctorate degree from the State University of New York at Buffalo. He is a distinguished associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as secretary of the Board of Trustees at the John Hines History Museum. He has researched and narrated exhibitions on slavery in Pittsburgh and has written extensively about Black Pittsburgh. One of his most famous is Free at Last, with a question mark. As you all know, with the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln in 1863, slaves were on paper freed. Our keynote speaker's publications and community activities, to be brutally blunt, are too numerous to enumerate here. I would have to have 5 paper. But we would be remiss not to mention that he has received the Pittsburgh Courier's Men of Excellence Award. He has received Talk Magazine's Black History Merit Award and the University of Pittsburgh Chancellor's Distinguished Service Award. This man is very, very involved in the community and extremely well respected. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the esteemed Dr. Lawrence Glasgow.
Okay, I'm now thoroughly intimidated after that introduction. But it's a real pleasure to be here. I always like talking about history to people. Okay, you want me to?
Just move it up closer to you.
Yeah, I'm so tall. Will it reach? All right. Okay, I lecture actually without a microphone to my classes of about 50 students, and I can raise my voice, believe me, but this will make it much easier. Well, I want to thank Carol for what she had to say earlier. She covered a lot of ground very well. A lot of the things that she covered I was going to talk about, which is terrific because then I can talk about some other things. And so we get, I'll try not to duplicate what she said, but the two talks fit in nicely together. And this whole thing of the Underground Railroad, I just want to mention preliminarily. To me, one of the most interesting aspects that I haven't been able to figure out, I don't know the answer to this, but as far as I know, this was the only country with an underground railroad. Slavery existed. America only had about 10% of the slaves in the New World. Only about 10%. But yet we had the only underground railroad, so far as I know. You hesitate to say, you know, as soon as you say we were the only ones, somebody, oh, wait a minute, Belize had, what do you know, or some other country. But if somebody knows a place that also had an underground railroad, please let me know. I'll be very interested to incorporate that. So that's just one little thing. What I really want to talk about today is not so much the mechanics and dynamics and inner organization of the Underground Railroad. Carol covered a lot of that. What I want to focus on really is how the Underground Railroad, what the legacy of the Underground Railroad was, what the consequences of it were, what the good effects, remarkably positive effects of that railroad were in Pittsburgh. And I'm going to do that by looking at the Pittsburgh Black community, both during the time of the Underground Railroad and then in the years afterwards, and show what a remarkably progressive, well-liked, admired community it was by the white residents of Pittsburgh. So despite, there was plenty of discrimination, there are lots of things that were negative we could talk about. But one of the things I want to focus on is how the black community was liked and appreciated, how much respect they earned, and how that reflects well on the people of the Underground Railroad who helped get them there. So, sometimes we think about, outsiders are coming into the community, this could be bad guys, some people, bad hombres coming in, things like that. Because they're outsiders, we don't know them, they make people nervous. Well, in a way, the runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad were outsiders who came in. They were strangers to the community as well. But Pittsburgh treated them well, and they treated Pittsburgh well. And that's what I want to look at briefly today. So let's see if this base anything on technology. Wait a minute. All right, see, there we go. Off to a bad start. I'll ask Carol. Carol, what was the secret? Try all the buttons. Oh, I did. You're right. Try another button. This isn't the button that was recommended. Yep, but this is the right button. It's okay. This is the one that's going backwards. All right. That's fine. That's fine. What I want now, don't feel obligated to read this. Again, with technology, I was going to put my own computer with this text on the lectern, and then have just some slides for you to look at, which would have been more interesting. But this lectern isn't going to safely hold my computer up here. So you'll get the same text that I will be looking at. And sometimes when people see the text, they feel obligated, I've got to read fast to get it. But I'm going to go over the text, so just relax and listen to me. What I want to do, I want to start out with some examples of how the black community was looked at in Pittsburgh by the white community, by white Pittsburgh. This is from the Pittsburgh Weekly Advocate of 1841, which wrote, "The colored inhabitants of the Hill are among the most worthy and respectable, and their example for orderly conduct, sobriety, and the civilities of life are appreciated and warmly approved by their white neighbors." Doesn't get any better than that. I mean, you can't imagine a more glowing thing to be said. But this wasn't the only thing. I'll just briefly show another one. Church Conference sometime in the early 1830s, wrote in their publication, "It is but an act of justice to a majority of these people to state that they are making good progress in knowledge and sound morals, and that they are doing much to educate their children well." So again, we have text here that's not what we would normally expect to find opinions about a people who've come out of slavery. Most black Pittsburghers were helped to get here by the Underground Railroad. They came out of slavery. One would have expected them to be at the bottom, and at best they'd be talking about, well, poor creatures, but what can you expect given what they've been through in life? Instead, they're saying how remarkable they're doing. And this is accurate. I'll just give some brief examples of how productive and progressive that black community was, both then and we'll look at them in the early 1900s, how it continued. And they're the descendants of these people who came on that Underground Railroad, by and large, or many of them. That black community, what they talked about, the people of the Hill, how well respected they are. Whites lived in the Hill with blacks and whites. The Hill was an integrated neighborhood in Pittsburgh. We think of it today as an all-black neighborhood or a ghetto. It was not that at all. The great majority of residents were white, and they tended to be upper-class whites, or the wealthy, the professionals, the business people. The Hill was right next to downtown, and the downtown was crowded and polluted and dirty and muddy and this and that. And so the Hill was the first suburb of the city. People moved out of downtown into the pastures and the woodlands and the green area of the Hill. That was really the first suburb, and they'd walk to work downtown. The banker would be living in the Hill, and he'd walk to his bank in downtown Pittsburgh. Similarly, the janitor would live in the Hill and walk to the bank downtown too. Okay? So they were both sharing space. Blacks and whites in the Hill lived often side by side. Blacks, it was in off Wiley Avenue in the Lower Hill near the modern road station there, and then downtown there was another big cluster on around the area of Oliver Street. At the time, 3/4 of black households lived next door to a white household. Remarkable degree of integration, something that we've never seen since, something we would not see today. 3/4 of blacks had a white neighbor next door. So when they said their neighbors appreciate them, there really were white neighbors there appreciating this. A remarkable story that it's not in the book, it's not part of our usual narrative of black life in Pittsburgh. Half had a white neighbor next door. 1/4 lived in the same dwelling. So that's where the 75% comes from. Okay? The black community was a solid family-oriented community. 82% were two-parent, male-headed families. This is coming out of an experience where marriage was illegal for them. One of the first things they did when they got out of slavery was got married. 82%, this is from the manuscript census of 1850, had 82% of blacks living in two-parent families. They built their own institutions. The AME Church, which Carol talked about there, Bethel AME. By the way, I grew up in AME Church myself. Allen AME Church, Brown Chapel, whatever. They were not allowed to go to school with whites. They set up their own schools, as Carol had talked about. Reverend Woodson. I dated Reverend Woodson. Winona Woodson was my girlfriend back in the old days. So the Woodsons were a prominent family in Pittsburgh. Now I knew the Ohio Woodsons; those were the Woodsons I knew. But Reverend Woodson was a leader, founded in terms of church and in terms of education. That's where he used the school, used his church as a school. So when they said Sunday school, that really was a Sunday school. They really did teach literacy, mathematics, and things like that in the church on Sundays. Okay. They didn't drink. They were teetotalers. They issued a pledge of total abstinence, saying that total abstinence from intoxicating liquors is the only safeguard for the temperate, and that the future of our brethren, now groaning beneath the iron hand of the oppressor, will depend materially upon the state of morals among the free people of color. Therefore, we pledge ourselves neither to drink, nor buy, nor sell, nor give away any intoxicating liquor. And for this, they were greatly praised by the local white community as well. I mean, that's a model community. It's really a model community of people coming out of slavery. So this is going to be one of the things. How is this possible from all that we know about how slavery degrades what's going on here? Well, it wasn't that they were getting good jobs in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a booming economy. As the steel industries, or iron industry, not steel, the iron industry was growing. In Pittsburgh and other places in the north, they just would not hire. It was just unthinkable to hire blacks. So they could not get good jobs. They could not get good jobs. Many of them worked as day laborers, which is guys who don't have a regular job. They just show up on a certain street corner at a certain time every day. And people who want somebody, temporary labor, will go by and say, okay, you, and you, come with me, I got a job for you. But that's not a steady job, and that usually leads to unstable men. Okay, if you don't have a stable job, you're not a stable person. But here, they did. They did. And a lot of them took up self-employment. They set up their own businesses. That's what, like Woodson and barbering, that was the most prestigious occupation for blacks at the time. These were barbers who only cut white hair. This is not like a neighborhood barber shop that cuts the hair of, like we think of, okay? Like, they're not black barbers cutting the hair of their black neighbors. These are black barbers exclusively cutting the hair of white people. Lewis Woodson was a barber downtown, exclusively cut the hair of doctors and lawyers and merchants, white doctors, lawyers, and merchants. Because if he had blacks in his barber shop, whites wouldn't go in. So this was the most prestigious job that they had. Oh, I do say clientele exclusively white. And they often lived above their shops downtown. Lewis Woodson certainly did, and others. But it was they were catering to the elite of white Pittsburgh. Again, this sort of relationship. Oh, there's Lewis Woodson. Thanks to Carol, I can glide right by Lewis Woodson. You got the story on him. You got even more of the story of Glasgow's relation with Lewis Woodson. But he was a teacher, a barber, anti-slavery leader. He was he was one of the 2 or 3 leading figures of the black community and set the tone for it. John Vachon, thank you, Carol. I don't need to go into his, but he was, again, he owned a livery stable and a student saloon in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, before he came to Pittsburgh in 1827. And Carlisle is close to an area I want to talk about soon. He owned the first ladies' public baths west of the Alleghenies, all white, well-respected, discreet and respectable. The paper said a woman can go in and in total confidence of her privacy and all this, because people didn't have baths in their homes, so they went to public baths. And so for women, they were always worried that, is somebody going to be peeking in or who knows what? And Vachon's shop had the reputation of being very, very good about this, very honorable shop. The fact that it closed on the Sabbath on Sundays drew a lot of praise from the local press as well. Not only did he not drink, he didn't work on Sundays. So this was a sign of being a really good religious person. Discreet, respectable, clean, and high quality. Well, here's a little description. He has 13 bathing rooms for the use of gentlemen, supplied with an abundance of hot and cold water of the purest quality. The upper story is intended for the use of ladies and is richly furnished. Every precaution has been taken to secure the ladies' utmost privacy and security. So, again, speaks well for him. Turfley, again, just to show you, I won't spend a whole lot of time, just to show you the number of really outstanding, or some examples of the really outstanding citizens, black citizens in Pittsburgh at the time. The Turfleys were one of those. He was a contractor. Henry Collins was a land speculator, and it's even thought that he was the one who laid out the Hill District. That is, that the hill was his. He parceled it out. He was like a developer, modern developer, if you will. Some of the most interesting ones were the John and Edna Julius, who owned the Concert Hall Cafe and Resort. He was a violinist and a dance master, and the city's white elite. It was for the city's white elite to attend. And in 1840, that was one of the climaxes when President William Henry Harrison attended a concert there and spoke publicly about what a fine place it was. Again, who would have thought? Owen Barrett, a pharmacist who worked for a prominent local pharmacist, Fonstock, And Fahnestock raised him and trained him. And Barrett went on to make some really important discoveries, medical discoveries, medicines, which he patented and gave Fahnestock the profits from those. Martin Delaney, I know Carol talked about Delaney again. He was probably Pittsburgh's most famous black resident. I have a lot of stuff on Delaney. But you, Carol, you did cover. Yeah, Delaney. Okay, good. I'll go on past Delaney then. He founded a newspaper, which you mentioned. That was the one who covered the Great Fire. And it also covered some plague that ravaged Pittsburgh. Cholera, the big cholera epidemic, his paper had almost exclusive coverage of. And he helped Frederick Douglass edit the North Star abolitionist paper. We'll go past Harvard Medical School. And he was very interested in Africa. He wanted blacks. At a certain point, he got so pessimistic about the future of race relations in America that he said, the only thing we can do is to return to Africa. And he sailed to Africa, signed some treaties with African chiefs for blacks to come and settle there. And this was in Nigeria, chiefs. It never happened. The migration never took place because he negotiated these treaties in 1860. And 1861, well, it was all over. It was then Delaney and any black man of stature said, we're not going back to Africa. We have to fight and try to free our enslaved brethren. We're lucky for all the things that we have to go through. Compared to our brethren groaning under the yoke of slavery, we have to go and fight to free them. So Delaney threw his whole immigration thing aside, joined the U.S. Army, became the first, and I think the only, black officer in the U.S. Army. He was a major. He was also very race conscious. You can see by the names of his children. One was called Toussaint Louverture, from the Haitian Revolution. Charles Lennox Remond, who was another abolitionist. Alexandre Dumas, the French writer. Saint Cyprien, Faustin. Placido Rameses, who led a slave revolt in Cuba. Ethiopia, well, you can see where this is headed. George Vachon, we talked about the Vachons, or Carol talked about the Vachons, who studied law here in Pittsburgh under Walter Forward, who was one of the leading attorneys in Pittsburgh. Forward Avenue, you know, there in Squirrel Hill. It's that Walter Forward. And blacks couldn't be admitted to school. White students didn't want to study with them. That's what happened to Delaney at Harvard. And so people like Forward and others, attorneys and doctors, would privately teach blacks law and medicine. So like an internship, you might say. And that was the case with George Vachon. Now, certainly Pittsburgh had slaves. I teach a class, History of Black Pittsburgh, and I take my students to Woodville. If anybody's been to Woodville, out toward Heidelberg, which was the home of oh geez, my brain. Neville, yes. John Neville, his home, the big, the guy who was caught up in the whiskey rebellion because he was the tax collector and people didn't want to pay taxes on their whiskey. Two things you don't mess with in Pennsylvania with guys, whiskey and taxes. That was a double whammy. But that was the resistance. Well, Carol has talked really about some of the resistance of blacks. There's just an example of they were slaves here, but when they possible they ran away. There were no slave revolts here. In fact, slaves, Neville armed his slaves when the Whiskey Rebellion broke out. He gave them guns to fight the rebels, which they did because they said, we're fighting to save our own home here. You know, they want to burn down, this is our place too. Neville, if it burns out, he'll just buy another place, but this is where we live. So they, usually you don't arm slaves, but they did. But they also ran away, okay, as slaves. Ran away from the subscriber. One of our best sources of information on, because you know, a lot of prejudice when they describe blacks, you know, it's like, well, can you trust it? But one thing people were very accurate about in their descriptions was when they ran away, because they wanted people to spot them. So they didn't make up anything. The best source of information, one of the best sources of information on slaves, are ads for runaway slaves, because they describe them, what they wear, what they look like, how they talk, whether they're clever, whether they're slow-witted. All of this is laid out in a, you know, it says 5 feet 6 or 7 inches, 40 years old, speaks bad English, swarthy complexion, hair more like a white man than a Negro's. I mean, these are really detailed. Suppose he will endeavor to pass for a freeman. Whoever gives him to Gertie will be generously rewarded. So a sad story. So there was slavery here. Again, this was a girl, Pris, 15, who ran away. Again, they describe her very carefully. 5 feet 6 inches high, slim made, handsome face, proud walk, haughty appearance. Slave with a haughty appearance. Had on, when she went away, a dark calico gown with a white and dye-colored petticoat, black wool hat. So they describe what they wear. See, very accurate. We get a sense of how people look, what they wear, what their posture is, how they present themselves. And these are not beaten down people, you know, that they're describing in these runaways. And these ads are accurate for good reason. Now we get to, what is it that makes this Pittsburgh black community so remarkably progressive? I argue, and I haven't proven this, so this is still being researched, that it depended on where they came from. They came primarily from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I don't know if people have been down the Shenandoah Valley, but it's one of God's most beautiful places in all of America, all the world. And it's also a place, it had slavery, but it had comparatively a much milder form of slavery than what blacks were accustomed to on plantations, because it did not have plantations. The slavery there was small farming, mixed farming. A white family owned a black family, typically. They lived together somewhere out in the country. They worked the fields together, black and white, side by side. It wasn't master sending Cephas or whatever out to the field to do the work under an overseer. This was the master working with the slave, side by side. So they knew each other. Blacks in such a situation got acquainted with white culture in a way that they would not have on a plantation. They had more independence than they would have had, because when you do farming, you do a variety of tasks. When you're on the plantation, you do the same dull thing over and over and over again. Mind-numbing, the brain doesn't grow. Farmers have to create, have to innovate, have to, be prepared for whatever. They have to have a lot of occupational skills because, everything needs repair at some point or another. And so the masters had a variety of skills. The slaves had a variety of skills, very unlike people coming off tobacco plantations or cotton plantations or rice or sugar plantations. These were people who did a variety of things. and therefore acquired a variety of skills. Another thing about the farming, they mainly raised wheat. Today you go down there in the spring and it's all apples, isn't it? You see the apple blossoms. Well, back then, they did raise fruit back then, but the big crop was wheat. Livestock, they raised livestock, and they raised some vegetables. They raised a variety of crops. But there's one thing about the work in that valley compared to plantation areas. It's not something that you have to do year round. Because when winter comes, there's really nothing to do. There's no work, you know. And it lasts a long time. And so during those periods, the masters would hire out their slaves to other people who needed their fence repaired, or a barrel made, or some repair done on their house, or needed some shoes made for their horses, things like that. And so blacks did those tasks as well as what they were doing on their plantation. And it got them out of the plantation. They got to travel around and see things, which opens your eyes, makes you a better person, a bigger person, a more knowledgeable person. And so that was another thing that gave these blacks in Pittsburgh, who were overwhelmingly from that Shenandoah Valley, gave them a leg up, a head start over their brethren who were on these large staple plantations elsewhere. Well, and I talk about a lot of them, they started out in the early days, they were the slaves, the whites also came to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a place where whites and blacks migrated to. Okay, they came out of that valley, that Shenandoah Valley, straight north pretty much, to Pittsburgh. Isaac Craig, he brought his slaves up when he came. John Neville, of course, which I've already talked about. Conrad Weinbittel, who was the ancestor of the Mellons and the Nagleys, same thing. Ministers of the Presbyterian Church had their slaves as well. But Pennsylvania, which had slavery, became the first place, possibly in the world, to outlaw slavery. That was 1780. It's really a remarkable thing to think about. Slavery is the oldest, we think it's the worst, one of the worst things man ever invented. Well, it's also one of the first things man invented. The earliest written record historians have is of slavery. It's as old as history. It was in Baghdad. Some rich guy died in Baghdad, and they did an inventory of his estate, and they carved it into the clay, and they enumerate his animals and his house and his home furnishings and his slaves. And this was about 5000 BC, something like that, long time ago. So we know slavery is one of the oldest, or perhaps the oldest institution, certainly one of the oldest. And slavery was also extraordinarily widespread. We find slavery, it wasn't just in Africa. Slavery was common in Europe. In fact, the very word for slave, the very word Slav for the Slavic people comes from slave. They were the source of the big slave source for the Romans, the Slavic people. It was found in China, in Africa, in the Americas. Every place had it. And one of the remarkable things is, not until the 1750s, 60s, 70s, 80s, do we find anybody saying this is a bad idea. This is terrible, a terrible idea, in fact. Jesus Christ never condemns it. Moses does not condemn it. Muhammad does not condemn it. Confucius. None of the great moral thinkers throughout time, if anybody finds one of them condemning. Please tell me before I go in print with this, and I'd appreciate it. But none of them all they would condemn is their own people should not be slaves. So the Old Testament is full of bad Pharaoh enslaving people. But then a lot of the rest of the Old Testament is how the Hebrew people should treat their slaves. Okay, they should treat them nice and all that. But it didn't say they should get rid of them. Nobody thought until the 1750s. It's one of the great mysteries of the human experience on this earth, that it took that long for people to say slavery is bad. 1750, it starts, 1760, 17, whenever, in that period, the Quakers and all that, it's in that period. And to think, within 100 years, people are dying over slavery. That's the abolitionist movement, that's the Underground Railroad. Finally, we go to war over it. So from something that was acceptable, and remember, like I showed, the Presbyterian ministers, and not just Presbyterian men, I don't know, pick out the Presbyterians, had slaves, but people would, in their will, they would will their slaves to their pastor, to their minister. And that was considered a good Christian thing to do, to give it to the church. The church took it and didn't think anything, and it's like, wow, 100 years later, it's like, how can you do that, So at any rate, this was Pennsylvania, 1780, right after American independence. Remember, 1781, America was formally declared a new nation. And they saw this new nation. They believed in what Thomas Jefferson, big slave owner, had written, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed with the rights to life and liberty. So you could talk about Jefferson as a hypocrite, or you can say he really laid out something that people followed. So it's a little bit of both, good and bad, because it's a transition. Nobody had ever condemned slavery before, and they're just feeling their way. Within 50 years of that, there's no question, a whole lot of people are saying, yeah. And slavery quickly declines in Allegheny County. In 1780, when the law was passed, 690 slaves. By 1840, there was 0. Really, by 1820, it was down to insignificant numbers. And once it got down low enough, the slaves, they didn't have to be emancipated. They just started walking off away from the master and went on and got a job, especially if they were young and male. Now, the ones who didn't tended to be older and female, who actually needed the master to feed them. And that's something we'll talk about a little later. Don't let me forget. Okay, so these Pittsburgh's blacks came from that Shenandoah Valley. In 1850 census, 43% of black Pittsburghers, this is the family heads or household heads, were born in Pennsylvania, 29% in Virginia, 14% in Maryland. Another 43% born in Pennsylvania, a lot of those are the children of Virginians. Okay, that's their children. They've been there long enough that they've had children who've grown up. So it was a heavily Virginia and Maryland population. As I say, coming from the Shenandoah Valley with those sort of characteristics of the Shenandoah that sets it apart as a relatively milder form of slavery, and one that opens up people to more experiences and more knowledge and learning and self-confidence too. And it also exposes them more to white culture than was done on the plantations. And we'll see that exposure to white culture where these guys outdid whites in culture in Pittsburgh later. But this is the area they're from. Stanton, people been to Stanton? Winchester, Harper's Ferry. What are some of those other towns? The other towns. Yeah, Winchester. Well, Winchester was a big center. I found when I look at records of later when blacks they're going, they'll have notices in the newspaper. They've gone back for somebody's funeral, or they're going back for a birthday or something like that, and it's often Winchester. That is frequently mentioned. So I'm gathering a lot of these came from Winchester. Well, Well, I've already talked a lot about the self-hire, working side by side with the owners, the sort of job skills they acquired, small farms and homes, and what they did. This is my poor excuse of trying to do a map of the Underground Railroad. It's not very good there. But I got to tell you, I went online and I looked up a whole lot of maps trying to get. Blacks went up, there's the Shenandoah River, so they come up the Shenandoah River to the Potomac River. They go up the Potomac River is heading south, but they could go pole or punt up the Potomac River till they get to where they transfer then to the Youghiogheny River, and that's the big river that brings them into Pittsburgh. It comes out in McKeesport, right? So that was the big, and that's the area that I have not researched like I would like to sometime. I got so many projects. Boy, to find out the Underground Railroad in those areas, those were the ones where they are leaving from, and those are the critical ones, and that's a long way. It's a long way to travel by yourself. They didn't have a lot of food. They didn't have maybe any food, so they depended on people willing to take them in. So that was something that really needs to be looked at. I'd love to get down into some of those towns and see what their local history groups have to say about slavery. Once people got to Pittsburgh, a lot of them, they needed the places like in the White Run Underground Railroad station stops, but those would be very and they couldn't use them a lot because well, they'd be found out. Then it wouldn't be secret. You know, people would be sitting around, oh, look at that, I think I know where the station is. So after they were there for a few days, they then would go into the black community in the Hill District and blend in with other blacks. That's the best way to escape. You know, go someplace where you look like everybody else. And so that's what they did. So both were important, because when they're out in the country, there aren't any black farms and places for them to stop. So they did depend on whites who would hide them out, but that would be a very temporary sort of thing. And it couldn't be on a regular schedule or it just, you know, because they'd be found out. But after a few days, then somebody would try to get them into town. 5 minutes, is that what you're saying? Okay. One thing when you talk about this, and I don't know how to research this, but 75% of the black population in Pittsburgh at this time was not black. It was classified by the census as mulatto, brown-skinned people of mixed racial background. So I said how close people were living, a black family, a white family living together, isolated. So they were doing more than just exchanging ideas. And I don't know the details of it, and nobody's talked about it. I'm just speculating. But something was going on, because 75%, that's an incredible number, is it not? 75% listed as mulatto. And then I go into, did mulattoes differ from blacks and whatever. Okay. Well, theater, Jim Crow, job discrimination, the usual stuff we know about. Let me just quickly mention then, and I'll wrap this up, which is when we look at that same black community, we see how progressive and advanced they were earlier in the century. At the end of the century, in the early 20th century, I just looked at one aspect of it, which is culture. At Pittsburgh is known for its jazz, right? Well, believe me, in 1900, they weren't doing jazz, they weren't doing ragtime, they were into classical music. Classical music was the music of preference in black Pittsburgh. There was this fellow, David Grant, he's a harpist from Rankin. He was so popular that in 1900 he declined to participate in a music contest in New York because he said, quote, it would seriously interfere with his other engagements in Pittsburgh. In 1920, Mary Cardwell gave a concert at the Carnegie Hall in her hometown of Homestead. She went on to found the National Negro Opera Company here in Pittsburgh. Okay, so there she is in 1920 doing this. They had instrumental groups such as the Xenorphica Mandolin Quintet, that's Xenorphica spelled with an X, which performed music of the Renaissance. Okay, and according to the newspaper, the group eschewed everything that is not classical and was enjoying a, quote, high, rapid, and substantial growth in popularity. They had the Grand Elysian Symphony Orchestra, which performed at the John Wesley AME Zion Church, the Orpheus Mandolin Club, Robinson's Orchestra, the Myers Family Orchestra, the Kelly Orchestra. These are all things that were between 1900 and 1920. So you find this sort of genteel, proper behavior that was stressed in the mid-19th century, continuing on into the 20th century. Now this changes, but that's for another talk, another time. But I did want you to show you what some of the positive effects, remarkably unforeseen positive effects of this Underground Railroad. What a blessing it was. It helped people, and they in turn helped make Pittsburgh a better place. Okay, thank you.
In the interest of time, I'm going to cut down. I was planning to speak only 12 minutes on 5 local places. I'll try to do it in 4 or 3 minutes. And then we can have fire questions at the panel. Just one quick point about what route was taken out of Pittsburgh. How did they get out of Pittsburgh? This stunned me. One of the main ways that on the Underground Railroad folks made the journey north was from Jack's Run on the Ohio River. And they apparently worked their way Jack's Run, heading what would be northeast. And then they'd find their way over to Millvale at Bennett Station. And then they'd make their way up what was then the Butler Turnpike. And they would make their way right past the Gilbert's house, or close to it, in Hampton. And then right where UPMC is today, Mount Royal Boulevard comes out on Route 8, and then more or less Route 8 heading its way from there right through downtown Bakerstown. Right through downtown Bakerstown. So it was interesting to me that when you think about it, they started from Pittsburgh and they went a little bit west and then they came back east. Again, they're trying to be secretive. So let's talk about 2 quick places very quickly in Hampton. In Hampton Township, there is a place, and I introduced to you Peter and Nancy, their gracious owners, whom they treated me breakfast yesterday. It was very nice. McCaslin's house, McCaslin, was one of the founders, or if not the founder of Hampton. And they live in that house. That was one of the first houses in Hampton. It then became called Scott's Tavern. Scott's Tavern. I won't give the address, but it's a very distinctive, distinguished looking house. It started out being white stucco. It's now a nice, I'd say blue-gray. Would that be right? Blue-gray. Beautiful house. Built, we believe, one source says 1850, but I think you told me 1820.
It says established 1820 above the.
Okay. And Peter yesterday took me to a most unusual site. I took some pictures and blew them up out here in his house, but apparently the slaves would be hidden in the basement. But then if people figured that out, and you'll see one picture, there was a hole in the basement ceiling, a small hole, and somehow, some way, they could make their way up that hole and scoot out the back. Just amazing. A second Hampton property that I haven't been able to confirm, there supposedly was a Saunders, S-A-U-N-D-E-R-S. I'm not going to talk much about it. I didn't see it on an 1851 map. And it was a recollection of his grandson in 1933, who at the time was, meaning no disrespect, 49 here, but at the time he was 88 and supposedly had a bit of dementia, so I'm not going to talk about that. Let's move to Richland Township itself. In Richland Township, the primary receiving, loading, and unloading place actually was not the Brickell House, but it was the Guthrie House. Have any of you ever been to Sweet Bees on Heckert Road? A Methodist pastor here, who had some help from the aforementioned Saunders, built a house at the crossroads, a sizable house, and slaves were hidden in the basement. Supposedly there were tunnels there. Win Smathers, who now owns the building, Sweet Bees Bakery is there, Crumpy's Furniture was there, numerous, Tom Henry Chevrolet in 1958 started out being there. Before that, there was a Buick dealer there, and we believe that building, we're trying to really hone in, but I believe it was in the early 1900s. When Guthrie moved out, he sold it to a Dr. Harper, H-A-R-P-E-R, and he may have continued to hide slaves. But remember, in 1863 was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, so technically anyway, there was no more need technically for the Underground Railroad. A second place in Richland Township is a place on Dickey Road called today, some of you may have seen it, Walnut Knoll. It is Tom Henry House. When Tom Henry, who wrote an article for us, he and I met, that's not his relative. What happened is, in 1837, and the reason we know that is it was on the beam of the original house. In 1837, John Henry and his wife Rosanna was illiterate. Even though illiterate, the job that she did hiding slaves is phenomenal. They built the house. He originally had 150 acres and he bought 60 more. They hid slaves, and they hid them in an unusual way. You'll see some pictures here. I took them. In the basement of the house, there was a basement, but then there was a secret basement inside the basement. The only way that you could get into the secret basement was through the front hallway closet door where you'd hide your coats. On the floor, it looked like a floor, but it wasn't. You could raise one of those takeout piece of floor, but there was only 3 feet 11 inches between the bottom of the beams and the dirt floor. But that's where they hid. No light, no air. Remember, they were only hiding there during the day. They traveled at night, making their way up to Erie, Detroit, Niagara Falls, most likely Erie, trying to get to Canada. Because again, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act said that any official that didn't return a runaway would be severely punished. A sad time for the United States of America. The northern states typically would never agree to that, but they agreed only because it was a compromise with the southern states. Robert Kruljack, who's a member of our group, he was going to be here, took all these pictures before he bought it, and I was going to have him come up and say a few words. The other place here in the township, of course, is, folks, the Brickell House, the 1831 Brickell House. There's a write-up that I did briefly to put in your program. But what's interesting about that is, and Sister Judith Ann took me up there, where the slaves were hidden in the Brickell House was in the attic. Inside the walls, you know what a knee wall is, it only goes up where there's a sloping roof and a knee wall, there's not a whole lot of room. They had two wooden panels that appeared to be part of the walls. They could be removed, and really you'd have to almost, you couldn't really sit up much like the Walnut Grove house that I talked to you about, because there wasn't a lot of room there. So we speculate that what would happen is the runaway enslaved people would be somehow in Pittsburgh, would make their way to Gertie Run, would somehow come back to Millvale area, Bennett Station, head up Mount Royal Boulevard, which at the time was the Butler Turnpike, probably go right by Peter and Nancy's house, and then come out on Route 8, which was the Butler Turnpike, and go into Bakerstown. So they probably went there first, where Sweet Bees is, and then they somehow got them over here to the Brickell House. During the day they somehow slept there and then make their way out. So the point is that Bakerstown, Richland Township, Northern Hampton were huge areas for helping people. And I believe one of the reasons for that is it was the farmer mentality. These are farming areas. In those days, people, a lot of people were church people, and they just had a passion. Farmers had a passion for helping others. And I don't think I'm going to do any more detail because it would bore you. I'd like to get to the questions, but just think in terms of, astoundingly, Richland Township and Hampton Township were big areas of helping enslaved people. And now what I'd like to do is have an open forum here with our panel. And if, say, Chuck, maybe you could take this mic, if any of you have questions at any of us, fire away. We'll see how far out this goes. And so we can hear your question, and fire away, and then we'll close our program. I think Emil, we'll play some songs on your way out. So if you have questions for us.
Limited knowledge of the history of the Underground Railroad. I always thought about mainly Harriet Tubman and the plantations being, which was the stream of people coming through the Underground Railroad. But you introduced this kind of other stream from the Shannon, as far as who came through Pittsburgh from the Shenandoah Valley. So is that like sort of two different groups?
For research, the Shenandoah Valley has not really been studied in terms of this Underground Railroad and the runaway slaves. We know there were, but it just has not been examined. They're beginning to do a lot more historical research now in the Shenandoah on the black presence there, but that's just in the past 5 to 10 years. Most of the studies of the Shenandoah have been about the Civil War there. There were terrific battles down in the Shenandoah Valley, and that has really preoccupied most historians of the Shenandoah. But now they're starting to turn their attention to this, and I'm excited to see what they come up with. But certainly the idea of the sort of farms that the slaves worked on, that's one thing they've really laid some new ground for. But they really haven't done much with the Underground Railroad, other than I can tell that they're coming from the Shenandoah because Black Pittsburgh had this column called Afro-American Notes in the Pittsburgh Press. It was a weekly column of what was going on in the black community. It's sort of like a community bulletin board. And they talk about who was going home for a birthday party or for a funeral or to visit or whatnot, or they were getting visitors, and it was Winchester and Stanton and places like that. We got a sense from that of how strong was that Shenandoah thing. And when you look at the geography, that's the straightest route. If you'd come up otherwise, you have to cross those Allegheny Mountains, which are some to cross. Whereas this, you can follow the curve of the way the contours of the mountains and the rivers, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I don't need the mic, you can hear me.
Hey.
Says here, a state constitutional convention, 1837, disenfranchised black residents. I'm assuming that means they were denied the right to vote.
Exactly.
Right? When did they get that right back, and how?
They got it back with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Pittsburghers and Pennsylvania blacks got the right to vote at the same time they did in Mississippi and Alabama. It was the same federal law. It was one of the biggest disgraces. The only thing I can say good about it is that Pittsburghers opposed the disfranchisement. White Pittsburghers, Walter Forward, all these guys in the state legislature campaigned against it. It was a Philadelphia idea. There you go. There you have it. No, seriously, it was Philadelphia that pushed that thing through.
Thank you.
Yeah. So go Chiefs. Yeah.
But do you know, or do you have any recollection or evidence of how many were captured, the slaves, in this area or nearby or Pittsburgh or this area?
You don't
And
hear.
what were the consequences?
Yeah. You don't hear. You hear of occasional captures when the black community here, especially the waiters in the hotels, that was one of their major occupations. I said barbering. Well, being a waiter in the downtown hotels was another big occupation. So they saw people passing through. And if they saw a white person with someone who looked like a slave, they'd send the call out and get a gang there, and they'd separate the two, take the black person and hide him out someplace in the Hill District. And so that was regularly done. And it was done with basically the permission of the city officials. That is, the mayor didn't send the police in to stop them from doing. They knew it was done on a regular basis. So that again speaks well for Pittsburgh and the sort of leadership here that was sympathetic to the plight of slaves. I don't hear of people being captured and taken down. If they were, the only ones you hear about are where they did try to capture someone, then these black vigilantes would come in and steal them back. They'd rescue them from the hotel. Because they cleaned the rooms, and they'd figure out, they knew how to open the door, and they'd go in when the person was away and take the slave and take them out. One time they made an awful mistake. This woman was saying no, I'm not a slave, I'm free, but she's traveling with this white guy. So they thought, who are you kidding? And she fought him all the way to Cleveland before she finally persuaded him that she was free and this was her boyfriend. You know, and please, thank you, let me go. Me and Joe are heading out west, something like that. So there were a lot of stories like that, but I don't think the slave owners had much success in the Pittsburgh area.
When the slaves reached Canada, what was their reception and how did they take care of themselves? And then did they, once emancipation came about, did they migrate back?
Once emancipation occurred, a lot of people did come back. They were treated in Canada, well, like outsiders who were invading our, like the Mexicans. It's like, who are these people? And it wasn't a real cordial reception, but Canadians are basically kind of decent people, so it was physical violence against them. But they missed their home, they missed their friends, they missed their relatives, and a lot of them did come back. There were ties between Pittsburgh and Chatham, Ontario. The there was a black iron bell foundry outside of Pittsburgh. I don't know if it was in Monongahela. One of those sounds like that. And they cast a bell, a freedom bell, like based on the Liberty Bell, and established it in a black church up there in Chatham that they still have and show. My wife and I visited there once, and they still have that the bell there. So a real tie between Pittsburgh and
I was just gonna ask, you said that that we are the only country that had the Underground Railroad.
as far as I know.
Okay, why would that be? I mean, I can't imagine the plantation in Jamaica or other places were any less horrible.
Oh, they were much worse, yeah.
Than here. I mean, I wonder what made the difference. I mean,
I know, it needs to be investigated. But I've asked all my friends who study the West Indies or Brazil and places, and they've never heard of an underground railroad there. You had many more slaves, so it's not like, so it's another one of those things that keeps historians employed, trying to answer.
Could I, let me try to take that. Also, from something that I read, what I read was that in other countries, especially in South America, because the folks down there typically weren't white European, the slaves could fit in much more easily in the society down there, because the society down there, had darker skin than all 100% Europeans. I'm not saying that's a reason, but that was given as a reason why they may have been accepted more easily and fit in more easily.
I think we give it. I'll yell for you if they can.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Wondering about some of the people in the hotel during your 2 days as well. Quite soft in front of our place.
You've got this one, it's too long for me.
So, first question was on the Bakerstown Hotel. Is there any information on it being involved in the Underground Railroad?
Well, there were you all know there were two Bakerstown hotels. The first one was on Heckford Street. It burned down, and then they built the more recent one. There's nothing that we've uncovered that would suggest that the hotel itself was involved. But remember, if you were a station master, you didn't let anyone know. We have reason to believe that there were even more stations in our area than we know of. But none of us have come across anything that said that that would be maybe too obvious, a hotel. This had to be very, very secretive. And because again, there were severe penalties because of the Fugitive Slave Act that you'd incur. So no information about the hotel Underground Railroad.
I noticed nothing was mentioned about the tunnels that came into the Brickell House. Do you know anything about that? Tunnels.
There was a rumor that you could drive behind the Brickell House, behind the monastery here. There was a cave that was large enough to drive a team of horses and a wagon right into a cave, and maybe, I guess, when the Brickell House being down the hill. No one has ever found it, notwithstanding the fact that that was a rumor. The thought was, because the enslaved runaways seeking freedom were probably coming from Bees at the crossroad, Bees Bakery. This tunnel would have been on the hill right up here, and so no one that's lived here, and they've tried over many years to find that tunnel, but the sisters might like to take that on as a task, go out there and start digging.
See where it goes.
Being a Frederick Douglass aficionado, I just wonder, after Frederick Douglass started writing, after he started writing his wonderful, beautiful, inspiring writings, did that change, and did that perhaps give motivation or more impetus for more production? Underground Railroad, something started the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
Was he involved in some of that motivation, do you think, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Frederick Douglass did escape. He did not go on the Underground Railroad. He got a free black who knew how to read and write to write him some freedom papers, and he got on a boat in Baltimore and sailed up to Philadelphia. So he did not do that, and he actively campaigned not to publicize the Underground Railroad because that would tip off the slave owners. So he was very much opposed to publicity around it. So I don't think he sparked much in that regard. I don't think he stopped much either, but he was not he liked the Underground Railroad, but he didn't want it publicized, yeah, especially the routes and things like that.
Okay, folks, any last question for Carol? Anyone have a question for Carol?
Yeah.
Or one more question?
I'm not sure what the question is, but thinking of the trauma of slavery, the trauma of walking that distance, malnutrition.
Yeah.
Observations on the strength of individuals surviving that much trauma and malnutrition.
It is surprising when you think of, and puzzling when you think about how far people came, what they ate, how they ate. They often came up the river, so maybe they fished, but they also went overland. They weren't planting any crops, What did they eat? It's really, to me, it's a mystery, just how they survived, what they ate, where they got fresh water. You can't drink river water; that'll ruin you. So what did they drink? What did they eat? And I've never seen a satisfactory answer to either of those questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
program will be a speakers program. Ginny Campbell, sitting here, arranged it for us. It's going to be on Wednesday, May 10th at the Northern Tier Regional Library, and the topic is going to be a history of Route 8. Thank you very much for coming.